So I'm Catalina. I'm the new curator of Paleobiology at the Indiana State Museum. I started about a year and a half ago, so please feel free to chime in if you know more about Indiana than I do, which is all of you. I'm always happy to learn, but tonight what I'm going to be talking about is actually going to be based on I'm sorry. A little more closer? Oh, okay. Right here? Okay, I apologize, thank you. And if you see my hand dropping, just do this and I'll get it. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about mastodons, the giants of the North American Ice Age. And to get us started, I kind of have to set the stage and talk about the Ice Age itself. So here you might recognize the state of Indiana. The Ice Age of Indiana. The Ice Age is what we call the Pleistocene epoch. It's a span of time that goes back about 2.6 million years. So it's a very long period of time. It ended rather recently, only about 11,600 years ago. I know. I told Anne at dinner today, I am what paleontologists usually call not really paleontology. I'm too young. They're like, it's not in the tens of millions of years, it doesn't really count, but I work almost exclusively in this age. Thank you, Anne. Now, one thing to know, it's known as the Ice Age, but this is actually a period of both glacial and interglacial periods, right? So at their greatest extent, we had the pre-Wisconsin glaciation. And this is really important because if you look up, you'll notice that it went back only about 104,000 years ago, but it covers almost 2/3 of the state. So what this... Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I just did. What this means is that at this time, 2/3 of Indiana would have been covered in ice. This is thousands of feet of ice. This is a very heavy mass. These glaciers pushed forward from the north southward. They basically dug into the bedrock and they formed most of the landscape we have today, right? So all that sandstone, limestone that you see, it's basically been pushed through by the glaciers. These glaciers pushed sediment forward, and where they ended, or where the temperatures were basically too high for them to continue being frozen, they melted and they deposited a lot of that. One of the things that means, however, is that our fossil record has a little bit of a time span that's missing. So it starts kind of 3 million years ago. We kind of see nothing, and then we see the Ice Age material. Now, like I said, this is both glacial and interglacial periods. Your interglacial periods were periods where basically the state was frost-free. That means that you're going to have animals that lived in a very different dynamic community than when it was glaciated. This was a time, our last interglacial, or the Sangamonian, was a time where you might have found things like jaguars. You could have found giant land tortoises, different species of peccary, and this is really interesting because one of the things I'm going to talk about is how we read fossils. And one of the things that you do when you're reading fossils is you look at who's on the landscape and what does that mean, right? Which animals could have tolerated the climate of the interglacial versus the glacial, and the fact that we find remains such as jaguar or a giant land tortoise tells us that we have a record that goes this far back in time. It's rare, but they do exist. Most of the species might be extinct today, or some of them might have just moved, right? Your jaguars today, where do you think of when you think of jaguars? You think of Central America, much farther south, basically warm places, warm climates. Our mastodons, however, I know I covered the entire county, but I just wanted to point out that the mastodon on the map is Pulaski, so that's what he's doing up there. Our mastodons are much more typical of sort of our last ice age. This is known as the Wisconsin glaciation. We did have a glacier coming down into Indiana. It didn't come down quite as far, and when it retreated, it left a extremely wet, sort of mesic, temperate, forested environment. And we think part of the reason that the record of Indiana is is so rich in mastodons is that this is really a pristine habitat for them. We have here in Indiana and at the Indiana State Museum, one of the largest collections of mastodons in the country. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, we also have some of the most complete specimens, which have now ended up all over the world. And part of that is because, one, we think they were very numerous because of the climate and the vegetation that was here, but also because when these glaciers receded, they left this beautiful sort of wet, peaty land that sort of consumed or got a lot of these creatures stuck. It's a really good environment for preservation, and so when you find them, you tend to find well-preserved whole individuals, which is super unique. Okay, that being said, this interglacial period, or the end of this period, is actually honestly really cool for another reason. So during the Pleistocene, we didn't just have mastodons. We had essentially an entire megafauna community. So if you think of Africa today with its elephants and its camels and its giraffe, we had something almost equivalent here in North America at one time. We had mastodons, mammoths, we had giant beavers, Harlan's muskox, several species of peccaries, which are large kind of pig-like creatures. We had a different type of moose called the stag moose, the short-faced bear. North America had its own cheetah, American cave lion, and what's sort of incredible is that when the last ice age ends, almost 80% of all these species go extinct. We lose everything larger than a bison. The bison is the largest animal there is today. And then we're essentially left with them, some cervids, so a lot of deer and moose, and we lose, the saber-toothed cats, we lose the dire wolves, and it's still contested as to why, right? How much of this is climate change? How much of this is environmental change? Some things that were here moved. They did exist with things that we have today, such as foxes, badgers, coyotes, but there were also things like Arctic shrews, which no longer are here because they all went north, right? Jaguars from the interglacier all went south. So things are changing, and this extinction at the moment is sort of a question of climate versus anthropogenic pressures versus a mix of both. But the great thing about this is that despite the fact that these animals are gone, their remains of the materials stay in the earth. And this is sort of where my studies come in. So here is a single site from this county. This is the mastodon I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on, the Lewis mastodon site. Like I said, in Indiana, most of our complete specimens come from places like peat bogs and stuff. And as far as I can tell, almost all of them are found when somebody's digging a pond or a drainage ditch and says, hey, I found a really big bone. Would you come take a look for us, right? And this is super important for us because we both want to preserve and conserve these specimens. We want to be able to study them to see what they can tell us about when these animals lived. But we also want to be able to share them with the public. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit and tell you how I study fossils. So what gets preserved when you have a fossil? My fossils tend to be organic, so they're not mineralized, which means that I have actual collagen and things in the bones. And so I have a few different techniques I can use to study animals and see what they tell me. Bones are incredible. They're how we ID animals. You can see all the different species in a community basically by collecting different bones. You can get measurements of how large these animals were from lengths. You can identify how many males and females you might have in the fossil record. Certain diseases or injuries are preserved in bone. We have actually a dire wolf in the museum that has a broken femur and it's fused back together. So something like that might tell us, okay, this animal broke its leg, it survived long enough for the leg to heal, and then it died later on in life, right? And then we have chemical analysis, such as stable isotope analysis or radiocarbon dating or things like that, which help tell us how long ago the animals lived. It tells us what diet they ate, and what resources they used. So my interests really lie in seeing changes through time in all of these things. But for the sake of today, since I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the Lewis mastodon, I wanted to concentrate on how you do this. If you yourself go out and you find a mastodon, some mastodon bones, how would you identify, is it a mastodon? Is it a mammoth, right? These are both sort of elephant-like creatures. Do I think I have a female or a male? How big do I think this animal was? How old or young? So one of the biggest giveaways, if you're trying to do this yourself, are actually the teeth. Your mammoths and your mastodons are related. They're both from Proboscidea, but they diverged almost 20 million years ago from each other. Whereas your mammoths and your elephants today are only diverged by about 6 million years. So still a lot of time, but much, much closer together. And they had very different life habits and resource use. So if you look at the teeth of the mastodon, which is on, I'm sorry, your guys' left here, what you're going to see is these rows of paired cones and cusps. This tells us these guys were probably eating soft vegetation, more likely browsing, the same way you see in like deer or in some sort of pig species, so similar to our peccaries. Your mammoth teeth have these flat, ridged kind of teeth, and these are used for grinding. So they lay flat together, they rub forwards and backwards, and they can actually break down hard material, such as grasses. So these are, this dentition is more specialized for grazing, right? But if you have a tooth like the one on your right, you have a mammoth. On your left, you have a mastodon. Very nice and straightforward. Other differences you can look for, if you have a skull or a tusk, which, by the way, if you have a whole skull, that is amazing. Please send pictures. The tusks of a mastodon are going to be straighter. They're more forward pointing. They tend to have broader, kind of bulkier skulls, and all their bones are going to be kind of squatter and bulkier. Your mammoths, they have these long, kind of downward pointing curved tusks. Their skulls tend to be compressed from back to front, and your bones are typically thinner. All right, well, that's pretty cool. But then, what else can we say from this, right? Well, one thing that helps us determine, for example, how old an individual is actually the fact that, like I said, these guys are really closely related to African elephants. So what people have done is they've gone out and they've studied tooth eruption in modern African elephants. And what's really cool is that these groups actually have basically sequential tooth eruption. So they get 3 sets of deciduous teeth and 3 permanent molars in their entire lives. The teeth form from the back of the mouth and get pushed forward throughout their lives. So as your first molar gets pushed forward, it gets worn down, and then it eventually falls out. Same with the second molar and the third molar. And once they've used up all their teeth, that's all there is. But what's really cool is that means that you can actually look at which teeth are in the skull of a mastodon and determine about how old it is, because it follows a very similar pattern, right? So here you have 2 individuals. You'll notice a very big difference in size. The individual on your guys' left has these very large canals for where the tusks would have been, compared to the individual on your right. The one on your left is a male, the one on your right is a female, but what you'll notice is they both have very similar teeth in place. So you're actually looking at the second and third molar. The second molar's to the front, again, so towards where the tusks would be. The third molar's to the back. This tells us that equivalent to African elephant years, they're about 25 to 40 years old. But if we take an even closer look, what you'll notice is that the wear patterns on them are completely different. The female, right, still has that really cuspy, pointy kind of look. The white is just enamel. When the enamel gets worn down, it leaves that kind of brown surface, kind of flatter brown surface, that's dentine. The more you see of that, the more worn the teeth are. So your female here, she basically has her second molar and her third molar, and just a little bit of wear on that second molar. This is going to be a late 20s mastodon. She's young. Your male, on the other hand, has worn down the first cusp of his second molar and is starting to wear his third molar. So he's going to be a late 30s individual. So, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned, but if there's questions as I go, please do feel free to ask. Yes?
What year did you find was the Lewis mastodon found? Was it in the 90s?
It was in 2006.
Oh, 2006.
Yes, yeah. Actually, but speaking of that, let's go to the Pulaski mastodons. So, Anne was gracious enough to send me this article on your guys' website. This was super interesting. This is not the mastodon I'm going to be talking today. This is the mastodon in the Smithsonian, found here. And this is a very special individual, partially because it is nearly complete. So when you find an individual, or when you find materials, you're usually lucky to get between maybe 25 to 50% of a specimen. This specimen, I think, is predicted to be between 80 and 90%, which means mastodons have about 250 bones, right? You're looking at most of those bones. We in the Indiana State Museum have an individual called Fred, who's about 80% complete, and he's missing one of his hind legs, but he has, you know, similar to this, he has like the hyoid bone, which is your throat bone right here, which is really rare to find, but I would argue that this guy's probably even more complete than he is. So he's been he was found in 1914, I believe. It is a male, and it is still in the Smithsonian. It is not rare for mastodons like this to be found. They are in several museums in the United States. You can find them in museums in Europe. And they are almost always from Indiana, because one thing we have, like I said, is those really complete specimens, and it's honestly, a lot of them come from peat bogs, really murky sort of ground, but it's very, very good at preserving and keeping individuals together. That being said, the Lewis mastodon, so this guy's from 1914, the Lewis mastodon was excavated, donated by Greg Lewis to the museum, was excavated here in Pulaski. This is the initial dig site, which is essentially a pond. They were digging a drainage canal, I believe, and they ran into some bone, and they called the then curator of the Indiana State Museum, Ron Richards, and he brought a team out. There is 7 days of logs for this dig. The first 4.5 days are them trying to drain the lake and deal with the water and having all their pumps break repeatedly. So a dig is a very hard and time intensive system, and we rely so heavily on the help of the volunteers. The one thing I couldn't find that I would love if somebody could help me dig up is the name of everybody involved. I know there was a school from, I believe, Plymouth who came out and helped at some point, but so many people were on task to help with this. But yeah, so day 1, water, and digging for water. Day 2, more digging, and now you can see the pumps to get the water out, and people are finally starting to get into the mud. It took 7 days. It took, I believe, one of our now curators recorded 9 people falling straight into the mud or being dug up waist deep. But for perseverance, they got in there, they got really muddy, and then they started finding bone. So they had gotten some stuff from the spoil pile of the dig, and then they started finding in situ bone, right? So these are bones that are slowly being uncovered. You can see a couple pairs of ribs here. And you can see they found this gorgeous, almost complete scapula. So I'll show you where these are in a moment. And after 7 days, they were able to recover 34 bones. So again, this is really cool. 34 important bones is fantastic, but I think this also puts into perspective how sometimes the idea of having an individual that has 80 to 90% of the skeleton versus what is typically found, right? In this case, they found pieces of the front pieces, so part of a jaw, the scapula, so that's your shoulder blade, which is the big wing-like structure. And then they found a really good portion of the back left leg. So what's interesting is, unfortunately, with this guy, right, we don't have teeth, we don't really have a good idea of tusk size. How do we tell anything about it? Is it male or female? How old is it? We're not really sure. One thing we can tell, so if you look at the leg, you might see the two round bones right at the top. One of them is actually the kneecap, the one on the lower part. The top part is actually the head of the femur. And what's really, really cool is that it's not actually broken. You can turn it around and look at basically where the bone fuses while it's growing. So if this bone hasn't fused, it means that you still have a subadult individual that was growing in length. So we know this is a young individual. We have dated it. It's about 13,500 years old. So it didn't make it right up to the extinction margin, but pretty close. So it was kind of one of the last holdouts of the mastodons, probably in Indiana. And then while it was still growing, we can measure it and say, okay, well, what's our guess on how big this individual would have been, right? So for this, I just measured the two leg bones. The top one is the femur. That's your top sort of thigh leg bone, the longest bone in your body. For a full-grown mastodon, it comes up to about just that bone comes up to about my hip, right? And then the tibia, which is part of the shin bone. Together, using that together as an estimate, I would say the Lewis mastodon is probably about 8 feet tall when it died. That is proportional. That would be me if I was standing in front of it. So pretty big, still definitely able to turn its head and not even know I was there. But I think a very cool find, and honestly, it's just very cool to be sitting here knowing that I know some people in the room participated in this dig. Unfortunately, I obviously wasn't here at the time, but I would love to hear more about the actual excavation itself. We have all the bones in the museum. If anybody's ever interested in visiting the Lewis mastodon, please just get in touch with me. I'd be happy to have you. If you are in Indianapolis, I'm always happy to take people back into the collections and show them. We have some individuals that have a bit more material if you want to see a whole skull, but I just wanted to end there, say thank you, take your questions. I know that was a little bit rapid, but if there's any questions I can answer, please do let me know. Thank you. Where are the rest of the bones? That is a great question. So sometimes when animals don't stay, like why don't we find all the bones, right? If I just went on and on about how great preservation in peat bogs is. Sometimes you do get erosion, so you do get like, if through time there has been movement of water and washout, sometimes bones get pulled away from each other. Sometimes they get broken or they erode away. For some reason, they don't all preserve in the exact same place. Maybe when it died, something actually scavenged it. So you might get, it dies, a scavenger or a predator comes, drags away part of the animal, and you're only finding a piece of it, right? So there's a lot of things, but yeah, in this case, they did a pretty thorough job, and that's what they were able to find. Yeah.
You might have said, but I misheard, maybe I didn't understand.
Sure.
Mammoth and Mastodon were not on at the same time?
So they did overlap. In all of North America, they did overlap quite a bit. In Indiana, there would have been some overlap between them, but our mammoths tend to be older than our mastodon. Our mammoths tend to date back older than 15,000 years, and our mastodon tend to date between that 15 to like 12,000 year range. And that might just be part of, a record bias, but there's likely some overlap. What's interesting though is that it's very unlikely they would have actually competed for similar habitat because they have a different resource use. They're largely migratory, so we know that these animals in their lifetimes would be traveling hundreds of miles between their summerine and their breeding sites. So they would have been sharing the land at some point, but from our record right now, there's not a ton of overlap in time. Yeah.
They're the same age, basically, right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, they're young. They're definitely before, all of ours come before the end of the last ice age, essentially, that last glacial period. Yeah. Yes?
Do you attribute the fact that you have so many well-preserved mammoths here to, a lower population of predators or something like that?
That's a great question. I don't know. I kind of attribute it likely to entrapment. So sort of, if you've heard of the La Brea tar pits, and they also have a lot of material, and part of that is just the way the animals were dying was they were getting entrapped in this tar, and then they were getting pulled in, and they were and then they're just stuck where they are. I think that in here we just have the right conditions for that to happen in murky water and peat, essentially, peat bogs. But that is my guess for now. I hope to one day be able to answer that question. I will also say this mastodon is currently actually part of a new project that's going on. So I mentioned radiocarbon dating and our ability to tell how old these are. What we've found is that different forms of preservation, so if you find one in the desert, right, and it's been out in an arid environment, if you find one in tar, if you find one in a peat bog, we know that they're potentially getting contaminated with younger or older carbon, and that'll change your date on them. And so this particular mastodon, because he was found here in Indiana under these conditions, he has been resampled, and he's getting sent out to test new techniques to see if we can actually get more precise dates depending on what type of depositional environment they come from. So we're basically trying to see how does where they're found and how they're found change our dates, and that'll be really cool because there's a potential for our extinction horizon, so when they disappeared from the landscape, to shift. If we find that all the youngest ones, for example, are marked by the environment they're actually getting pulled out of. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
Did they travel in herds then, or were they individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we, again, one thing about studying fossils is that for the ones that are extinct, we rely heavily on things that we think they're related to that would have acted similarly. So from what we've seen in the record, we assume they were very similar to African elephants, actually. Studies on the atoms of certain individuals and their landscapes basically have been used to track movement, and what we found is that males, probably similar to elephants, acted kind of alone. They moved a lot more, whereas when you get females, when you get multiple individuals together, you might find females with juveniles, and that's not as common with males. Males tend to be found alone, females might be found. We don't have a lot of sites here in Indiana where we have more than one individual, but there's a site out in Illinois where they've really found multiple individuals, and I believe the majority of them are female. So yeah, that's our best guess.